Erev Tov, everyone. Tonight we're going to be learning about a particular person in history known in Hebrew as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and we'll find out why he's called the Prince. Did he have a palace, a castle? There's a specific reason he was given that title. So again, this video will refer to as Judah the Prince, but before we get into specifically this man and his role in Jewish history, specifically the authorship or editorship of the Mishnah, which is a compilation of some of the most important rulings in Jewish history that basically set the stage for Rabbinic Judaism as we know it. It's important to put Rabbi Yehuda the Prince in context. And the reason for that is not only can you appreciate what he did, why he's so important to history, but we're talking here both last week with Rabbi Akiva, next week when we talk about Hillel and Shammai, we're talking about men who were great men, did incredible things, but they also lived, well over 1,000 years ago, sometimes even much, much longer than that. And the problem is, while these men left a lot of great textual evidence, they helped put stuff together. At the same time, there's a lot of legends about them. And sometimes it's difficult to weed out what they really did, stories about them, stories about other people that got mixed together. We even have people today in the year 2023 who are politicians, celebrities, where we make these amazing stories about them and they're still alive. So imagine the stories we tell about people from over 1,500 years ago. So by looking at Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in context, we can see how he fits into history. And then what we'll do is we'll look at some of the texts that describe Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, which, well, there's certainly a great amount of truth in them. There's probably a little other stuff mixed in as well. But I want us to be able to appreciate what he did. So one more person is joining. I will just let them in. And then let's go ahead and start the video.
Okay, just a little context for you. During the Hasmonean era, two prominent sects of Judaism emerge. The Pharisees believe, according to the practices dating back to the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that both the written and oral laws of the Bible are binding. They're the majority, and oppose the Hellenization, or assimilation into Greek culture, accepted by the Jewish political rulers of the time. The Sadducees, on the other hand, believe only the written law to be binding. This group consists of the social elite, who accept the secular Greek influence of Hellenization. The two sects have your regular old Taylor Swift, Katy Perry feud, and tensions exist throughout the final duration of the Hasmonean dynasty. The destruction of the Second Temple is horrific for all of the Jewish people, but especially the Sadducees, who essentially die out after the tragic event in 70 CE. At the same time, the Pharisees' ideology continues, and those who teach its laws begin to receive the title of rabbi. The era of Rabbinic Judaism emerges. The rabbis played a central role in Jewish life, replacing the temple as the focal point of law and custom. Every great tournament needs its team rivalry, and in Judaism, this is no less apparent than during the time of the Zugot. During the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Zugot, or rabbinic pairs, are established within the Sanhedrin, the highest judicial body of Judaism, which rules over legal and religious disputes. The Zugot are kind of like president and vice president, and are known as the Nasi and Av Beit Din. Their main mission is to learn all of the Torah and transmit it faithfully to the entire Jewish people and future generations. Often, a duo of conflicting opinions emerges from the positions of the Nasi and the Av Beit Din. These duos hash out the application of Jewish law, and by virtue of their vast knowledge, are accepted as the keepers of Torah as it applies to daily religious life. The Zugot become the leaders of the people, transmitting the entire oral law to the next generation of Jews and tweeting the nation about their newest ideas. There were 4 different rabbinical pairs during the Hasmonean period, circa 142 BCE to 63 BCE, ending with Judah ben Tabai and Simeon ben Shetach. During the latter era of the Second Temple, the study of and commentary on oral law begins to expand as it passes down from one generation to the next. The disciples of Hillel and Shammai continue teaching their practices as well as implementing opinions of their own. These teachers are known as Tanaim, Aramaic for repeaters or teachers, and Chachamim, Hebrew for wise ones. They become the unofficial leaders of the nation and in some cases are more influential than the official ones. They're the experts on law under the Torah, developing and interpreting it as well as being teachers and moralists. After the destruction of the Second Temple, this focus on Torah as the governing force for everyday life becomes even more important. Without a physical capital to practice sacrifices and daily rituals, the Jewish people rely once again on Torah study and its commandments as a foundation for their national mission of living Torah-filled lives. Their study occurs mainly in the Beit Din, or Jewish school of higher learning, which centers in Yavne until the Romans move it to the Galilee region after the Bar Kokhba revolt. But after the revolt, the threat against Jewish nationhood is at an all-time high. The Romans close down the Beit Din and expel almost all of the Jews from Judea. The Torah and the memories of the land of Israel remain the sole vestiges of nationhood among the scattered Jews in the diaspora. In a world where Judaism faces this real threat, one man takes remarkable initiative to preserve the values of Torah study and the continuity of the Jewish community. Rav Judah HaNasi rises to fame in the Galilee in the north of Israel in the 2nd century. The grandson of Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, a former president of the Sanhedrin, Judah becomes the leading Torah scholar and therefore the official community leader when he assumes the title of president after the Romans once again permit self-governance within the Jewish community. Judah HaNasi fears that the fragmentation of world Jewry might lead to the disappearance of a nation and the abandonment of Jewish law. The increasing persecution and dispersion and exile makes it very difficult for each generation to hold on to the vast body of Torah knowledge. Backed by the other sages of the time, he makes a bold decision to write down the bulk of the oral law. Until this point, oral law has remained, well, oral. It was prohibited to write down the Torah because this might equate human interpretation with that of divine text. Yet, by Judah HaNasi's time, the Jewish people and many Jewish scholars are facing persecution, and there's a real risk of losing all that had previously been passed down by word of mouth. Judah HaNasi and the sages begin to compile some parts of the oral law into what we now call the Mishnah. The Mishnah translates to study in Hebrew and is comprised of 6 books and organized into 63 tractates. It's a miracle they found a publisher to print them all. Rav Judah HaNasi organizes and edits the collection by topic in a clear, concise manner, covering all areas of Jewish law. Until the Mishnah, Judaism had centered around the temple and the wisdom of the priests, known as Kohanim and Levites. With those positions now gone, Rabbi Judah HaNasi shifts the center of Jewish life more toward Torah study and practice. It's said of Judah HaNasi, from the time of Moses to the time of Rabbi Judah HaNasi, Torah and greatness were never so concentrated in one person. Judah HaNasi's primary goals are the maintenance and unity of the Jews in Israel, and he does this by encouraging widespread Torah study and observance of the religious and social code by all classes of people. He creates a social system based around the study of one unified text, and he preserves Hebrew as the language of prayer at a time when Aramaic is the daily language in the region. He becomes known simply as Rabbi, the teacher.
Excellent. So this video is from a YouTube channel called Unpacked, which makes these incredible videos all about Jewish thought, culture, and history. So there's a longer form version if you want to see it. But what I'm going to do right now is get out our other sources for this evening, and then we'll continue our conversation. And share screen, and excellent. Okay, beautiful. So, yeah, that's fine. Okay. There's a few things that the video, I think, pointed out that are really important. One is this massive shift between a focus on the Beit HaMikdash, upon the temple and sacrifice. And in those times, royalty was either literally royalty. There were members of the royal family, descendants of King David. Obviously, that's going back kind of before the Romans, but that was kind of where you looked to for royalty. Or the priests. They're the ones who often had a lot of money, which is kind of not right, because the way it was designed is the priests who ran the temple were not supposed to own land, so they wouldn't focus on wealth. But that's what happens, and there's even a little bit of corruption there. But then there was a massive transition. And again, in the video, she talked about this a lot, the transition from temple-based Judaism and sacrifices to Torah-based Judaism, where royalty and power were centered in those who were the teachers. And the wisest person, which historically was men. Today, now you have women scholars, but back then it was the men who were the wisest. They were the ones of the power. Now, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was part of a system. She talked about the Zugot, where essentially the leaders of the Jewish people were 2 men. She had a kind of a president and vice president, but one was kind of the head of the religious order, the Sanhedrin, the court that decided Jewish laws, ruled on Jewish cases, and the other one was involved in religious matters, but mostly they dealt with the government. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, as you'll actually see in some of these sources, became famous not only for dealing with the Roman government, but by being greatly respected by them and almost seen as kind of royalty in its own right. So while the term Nasi can be, back then it was less of like a royalty, like a king or a prince. It was more like a minister or something like that. To the Romans, Rabbi Judah the Prince kind of was seen as a prince among the Jews. He had a great deal of power. And just like the priests of old, with power comes a lot of mullah. So too, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, as again you'll see in one of these sources, was very, very rich. But what's important, and the sources will emphasize that, is what did he do with his wealth? Now, one of the challenges, as I said, again, learn about these men, is they lived well over 1,000 years ago. So there's a lot of legend weaved in. But the other challenge is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was compiling the Mishnah around the year 200. The date given is usually 220 of the Common Era. He actually had probably a whole school. It wasn't just him. He probably had a whole group of men working with him, editing, etc., like that. But if you want to learn about Isaac Newton and about his biography, you don't read his book Principia, which is his book where he writes about his philosophy, his science, etc., like that, his equations. You need to read a biography. So the Mishnah is not a book about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. It's one that's edited by him. So while it does include some of his teachings, a lot of the biographical material comes later, meaning he didn't at the beginning of the section say, I'm Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, here's when I was born, here's what I think, and now here are my laws. So a lot of what we know about him was written potentially decades, if not centuries, after he lived. And again, it's not like he was some random person from 5,000 years ago. A lot of the stuff we know about him is certainly accurate. But as you read these sources, you'll say it sounds like there are a few legends kind of, merging together in all of this. So those are really important to keep in mind in Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's story. And the other thing is, a lot of these sources aren't necessarily who Rabbi Judah the Prince was, but who the authors wanted him to be, who they valued, what they're like, this is the greatest a rabbi can be, and we're going to take Rabbi Judah the Prince and plug him in to these stereotypes of a great leader. So again, as you read his stories, you're like, I can see some of this is probably based on truth, but this part is clearly, when it talks about the end of his life, and you're like, oh, he probably did do that at the end of his life. But then this part sounds magical and supernatural. So again, that's the challenge about reading a legendary figure, is their history becomes legend. So what we'll do is we'll look at a few examples of his life. And again, don't necessarily look for historical fact. Look for what did he represent in the rabbinic tradition? What ideas were placed upon him that the rabbis of the next generation wanted to pass down in his name? So the first thing, Lindsay, I will go ahead and unmute you, is remember, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi edited the Mishnah together. And while the fact that he chose what was in and what was out meant that countless rulings of Jewish law are technically his ultimate decision, it doesn't usually mention him as much. It mentions him later in the Gemara, not as Rabbi Judah the Prince, but as Rabbi, our rabbi, my rabbi. But there are times in Pirkei Avot about wisdom and philosophy of the rabbis where he's explicitly mentioned that would have been contemporary. And I'll mention one other thing before I have you read this first source, Lindsay, is in the video, she had said that the oral tradition up till Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had not been written down. And in fact, when he wrote it down, it was actually a fairly stable time for the Jews, which is exactly why he decided to write it down then. Well, things are stable, let's write stuff down before things fall apart. And he was prophetic in that way. But it's missing something, which is that there were rabbinic texts that had been written down. There were manuscripts here or there. There were even alternative compilations that existed before the Mishnah that he was able to edit down. One famous one that we still have access to is called the Tosefta. So to make it sound like he just sat there and from memory with his group wrote down everything from scratch is not true. There was a lot of that, but a lot of it was them editing together existing manuscripts and editing other ones that were longer and earlier. And I don't think that takes away from it. It just gives you a more accurate version historically what happened. So Lindsay, we're going to jump right in with a little bit of the wisdom of Rabbi. And again, well, we can't be sure he said this. This is the kind of thing that it's very likely he really did himself teach. So please, source number one from the Mishnah that he helped compile in the section Avot.
Rabbi said, which is the straight path that a man should choose for himself? one which is an honor to the person adopting it, and on account of which honor accrues to him from others. And be careful with a light commandment as with a grave one, for you did know not the reward for the fulfillment of the commandments. Also reckon the loss that may be sustained through the fulfillment of a commandment against the reward accruing thereby, and the gain that may be obtained through the committing of a transgression against the loss entailed thereby. Apply your mind to three things, and you will not come into the clutches of sin. Know what is above you, an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and all your deeds are written in a book.
Excellent. Thank you. So there are a few things to point out here. One is his humility. Those last things there is just remember that at all times, God is keeping an eye on you. God is concerned and cares about what you do. And, just keep that in mind in all of your actions. So it forces this kind of humility, this awe, and a little bit of fear. But the other thing is this, he's talked specifically about the commandments. And he says there's some commandments that, might seem a little bit more minor. They may not seem like as big a deal. And then there are ones like don't kill. That's a big one. Oh, I kept not killing. I kept Shabbat, but I wasn't so strict on some of the laws of agriculture. And he says, you have no idea which ones really matter in the grand scheme of the universe. God gave them all to you equally. And it's a beautiful idea about equality in thought and the way we treat people, because how easy is that to think, well, this person I'm going to be extra nice to because they're a big benefactor, and this person I have nothing to gain from them, so I won't give them the time of day. Not only are we often wrong, but that's not the way to approach the world, because again, we don't really know what matters in the grand scheme of things. Money is not the end all be all. So he says, treat everything ultimately with respect, take everything seriously. So that's a beautiful way. And you'll see some of these ideas consistent throughout his biography. So the first part of his biography that we're going to look into is, as I said, we don't know everything about him factually, but one thing that's pretty well established is he was not a happy camper in his tummy. He was quite well known to have incredible gastrointestinal issues. It's likely, not only likely, as that is really what ended his life. We don't know the exact medical condition that he died from. There are probably some hypotheses based on common things at the time, but it was known that he was miserable and often got quite sick, with the stomach sickness. But what's interesting is that when they write about it, rather than just saying, oh, he was known to get sick all the time, and Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for this next source, is they tried to put that suffering into the context of, even though he suffered, it wasn't without purpose. Somehow his suffering fed into his holiness, or allowed him to learn and to become a greater person. And they put in the context of the suffering of others. So it's never just, here's a fact about him, move on. Somehow this was part of the greatness of the man. So Jane, please. And again, these are, there's no one section of the Talmud that's the section of Rabbi Judah the Prince. It's all over the place. So this one is in Bava Metzia, a section that typically deals with laws of civil issues and business ethics. Please, the Gemara returns.
The Gemara returns to the previous incident. When he heard that the greatness of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, was due to his suffering, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to himself, afflictions are evidently precious. He accepted 13 years of afflictions upon himself, 6 years of stones in the kidney, and 7 years of scurvy. And some say it was 7 years of stones in the kidneys and 6 years of scurvy. The Gemara relates, the stableman, Ahuriyah of the house of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was wealthier than the king Shapur of Persia due to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's abundant livestock. When the stableman would place fodder before the livestock, the sound of their lowing would travel the distance of 3 mil or miles.
Yeah, which is just, it's a distance. I don't know exactly how it translates, but it's a fairly long distance. And that's the point, as you'll see as you continue on. This is not like 20 feet.
He would calculate the right moment so that he would place the fodder before the animals at precisely that time when Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi entered the latrine, so that the lowing of the animals would drown out Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's screams of pain. But even so, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's voice was so loud that it overcame the sound of the livestock, and even sailors heard it out at the sea. That's interesting because he's in the middle of the Galil, right?
Yeah.
The Gemara says, but even so, the afflictions of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, were greater than those of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. The reason is that whereas the afflictions of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, came upon him out of love and left him out of love, in other words, they were solely the result of his own request, not because he deserved them, those of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi came upon him due to an incident and left him due to another incident. The Gemara stated that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's suffering came upon him due to an incident. What was that incident that led to his suffering? The Gemara answers that there was a certain calf that was being led to slaughter. The calf went and hung its head on the corner of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's garment and was weeping. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to it, "Go, as you were created for this purpose." It was said in heaven, since he was not compassionate toward the calf, let afflictions come upon him. The Gemara explains this statement, and left him due to another incident. One day, the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was sweeping his house. There were young weasels lying about, and she was in the process of sweeping them out. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to her, "Let them be, as it is written, the Lord is good to all, and his mercies are over all his works," from Psalms. They said in heaven, since he was compassionate, we shall be compassionate on him, and he was relieved of his suffering. The Gemara relates, during all the years of the suffering of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, no one died prematurely, as his afflictions atoned for the entire generation. During all the years of the suffering of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the world did not require any rain, as the moisture of the dew was sufficient.
Thank you. So in this whole section here, we pick up a lot of things. Now, again, biographical details that are almost certainly accurate is that he, again, suffered from gastrointestinal issues. Now, of course, the Gemara and its legendary status exaggerates this, as you pointed out, Jane, that his screaming when he had to use the restroom went on for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. Now, of course, that's not literal, but the point is that he really genuinely suffered. The second part, before we come back to that suffering, is that he was extremely rich. It was saying that, like, even his, the person who ran his livestock, his stable, was rich himself. So even if the butlers were filthy, if they were rich, all the more so he was incredibly rich. And again, he was rich. That was really important because he could not have pulled off this project of compiling the Mishnah if he didn't have the money to get buildings, to have access to manuscripts. Remember, he had to write it down. You couldn't just go to Staples and buy a printer and a keyboard and stuff like that. You had to have wealth to be able to put this down. And you want to make multiple copies. Again, so much money had to go into this, and this was all his personal wealth. But the other interesting thing here that's very beautiful is, well, there's this little bit of comparison. Yes, he suffered, but his suffering wasn't as meaningful as this other rabbi who suffered for the sake of the people. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi suffered because he was really mean to a cow. This cow who was, "Oh, I know you're suffering, but you know what? You're going to be hamburgers for dinner, so die." And then later he saw weasels who there's no point in saving them, and he said, "You know what? I'm going to give you a second chance." But the point is, here, rather than making him a perfect paragon of a human being, they actually show human growth. And I think that the author of this particular legend, or the one who compiled and edited this version, I think that's really important, is that the greatness of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, again, is there are plenty of rich people out there, but what do you do with your wealth? There are plenty of people who suffer, but through their suffering, do they find meaning in it? Do they find purpose? Are they just going to suffer and say, "Oh, the world is all about me"? Or are they going to try and use their suffering to make themselves better for the sake of others? So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had growth. He wasn't always the nicest, most compassionate guy. He messed up. And in time, he had opportunities for growth. So this is true not only of the Mishnah and the Talmud and these men and women, but also of the Torah. The humanity is the greatest thing they have to offer us, their capacity for growth, the fact that they weren't always perfect. And even though I didn't bring every source about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the next section here talks a lot about or specifically an example of the relationship he had with the government. Now, it talks about these imagined conversations with him and Antoninos. Now, historically, there wouldn't have been an Antoninos. Like, we have no idea who that is historically. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did live during the time of the Romans, but whoever this potential general was probably didn't exist. It might have been Marcus Aurelius, who was a real person, or it was just a made-up person to show examples of the kind of conversations that he would have had. The reality is he did talk to Roman officials on behalf of the Jewish people for protection, for money, etc., like that. But what's cool about these stories is that while in this one, he's the hero, and that's important. The Jews are often the heroes, and the Torah is ascendant. There's a couple of times where Rabbi Judah the Prince talks to Antoninos, and Antoninos poses a huge question, and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says, you know what? I'm wrong. You're right. I have something to learn from you. And that is what true humility looks like. Not somebody who says, I'm living a humble life because I'm a perfect human being. It's, I mess up sometimes, and I have things that I can learn from others. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next section, again, there's actually the non-bolded text here is from the Steinsaltz commentary and points out there's a whole page before this of other imagined conversations between great rabbis and other either Babylonian leaders, Roman leaders, etc., like that. And this kind of, just like in Greek plays, there's models of dialogue. So too in the Talmud, there are these models of dialogue where the rabbis have imagined conversations with secular leaders as a kind of platform for showing the greatness of Torah. And they have very, very similar structures. So even though you're looking at only one example here, again, you can find dozens of conversations with the same basic model, even though occasionally the Jews admit that they're not correct. So go ahead, please, Gloria. And this is the section Sanhedrin, which generally deals with the courts. But here it's Agadah, story, please.
Apropos exchanges with prominent Gentile leaders, the Gemara cites an exchange where Antoninus, the Roman emperor, said to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the body and the soul are able to exempt themselves from judgment for their sins. How so? The body said, the soul sinned, as from the day of my death when it departed from me. I am cast like a silent stone in the grave and do not sin. And the soul says, the body sinned, as from the day that I departed from it. I am flying in the air like a bird, incapable of sin. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to him, I will tell you a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a king of flesh and blood who had a fine orchard, and in it there were fine first fruits of a fig tree. And he stationed 2 guards in the orchard, one lame, who was unable to walk, and one blind. Neither was capable of reaching the fruit on the trees in the orchard without the assistance of the other. The lame person said to the blind person, I see fine first fruits of a fig tree in the orchard. Come and place me upon your shoulders. I will guide you to the tree, and we will bring the figs to eat them. The lame person rode upon the shoulders of the blind person, and they brought the figs and ate them. Sometime later, the owner of the orchard came to the orchard. He said to the guards, the fine first fruits of a fig tree that were in the orchard, where are they? The lame person said, do I have any legs with which I would be able to walk and take the figs? The blind person said, do I have any eyes with which I would be able to see the way to the figs? What did the owner of the orchard do? He placed the lame person upon the shoulders of the blind person, just as they did when they stole the figs, and he judged them as one. So too the Holy One, blessed be he, brings the soul on the day of judgment and casts it back into the body, as they were when they sinned. And he judges them as one, as it is stated. He calls to the heaven above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Psalms. He calls to the heavens above. This is the soul, which is heavenly, and to the earth that he may judge his people. This is the body, which is earthly.
Thank you. Now, again, for biographical information, the only thing that's even remotely accurate here is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi regularly did deal with Roman officials. Again, Antoninus, there was no Antoninus Roman emperor there. So again, who was he talking to? What was he talking about? Probably more practical political matters rather than teaching Torah. So everything else about this conversation is completely imagined. I mean, the parable itself, no one's claiming that that happened, but the idea that he could just go to a Roman Empire and argue with him about some theological thing about the nature of judgment and the difference between the body and the soul. And again, think about, two kids that both get in trouble, and a teacher, a parent says, which one of you did it? He did it, she did it. And the point is that both of them share the responsibility. That's the takeaway there. And again, it's a much more interesting conversation about how we see the relationship between our physical selves and our soul. But the point is that the Roman Empire probably didn't actually care about this kind of stuff, but the Jews did. And if they could imagine that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was having these high-level Torah theological conversations and swaying the mind of the emperor, makes him a hero. And that's something the Jewish people desperately needed. They needed heroes. They needed men who could not just stand up to, but be respected by the secular leaders. Because the reality is that in most cases, the Romans didn't really care about what the Jews were doing as long as they were, following what they were supposed to do, and they were docile and they paid their taxes, et cetera, like that. But here, the Jews are someone who are valued. The Jews are someone who are listened to. So that's why these stories, not just about Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, but about all these rabbis are told, is they make the Jews seem really, really cool. So today we tell these stories as if they actually happen. It's unlikely that they did, but it's kind of not the point. The point is that we want teachers to be the rock stars. Imagine if today in the 21st century, our greatest heroes weren't sports stars, but they were teachers. It'd be a very different society, which would be very cool. The last section here, actually, I'll pause. I haven't had a chance to pause for any thoughts, comments, or questions up until now. So any thoughts, comments, or questions up until now? Beautiful. So the last section here, and again, there's in some ways, there's a lot more about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and I have not been focusing on his rulings because in some way, the entire Mishnah is his rabbinic rulings. Now he'll quote, someone actually said it very beautifully, the Mishnah isn't written as on Shabbat, here's what you do and here's what you don't do. What it does is it codifies debate. Meaning at his point, there were some rabbis said on Shabbat, you're allowed to do this, some say you're not. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would often list both of those. But sometimes he would leave out a third opinion. Sometimes he would hint at which he thought was the right opinion. So by him being the main person in charge of editing the Mishnah, he basically is the decider of all of Jewish law, certainly in the Mishnah as we know today. So rather than go over individual rulings, rabbinic Judaism is greatly impacted in pretty much every single area, really without question, based on Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, because ultimately it was his say what made it in and what didn't, what became a specific opinion, which you could reject, or an anonymous opinion, which we often assume is the one that he wanted to be correct. So we're focusing more on here, again, on how he was depicted as a legendary figure. So the last section that we'll look at here, I believe 2 more sources about the end of his life. And as I said, they're not going to focus so much on what he died from, but it was clearly something connected to his gastrointestinal issues. But again, while some of this may be accurate to the final things he said at the end of his life, you can sort of pick up on the idea that the rabbis are using the end of his life, not in a demeaning way. It actually raises him up, makes him seem greater. And Samar, I'm going to unmute you for this. Using the story of the end of his life to both memorialize him, honor him, but also share certain values. Just like Jacob, when he was dying and he wanted to share certain values to pass on to his sons, so too Rabbi Yehuda the Prince at the end of his life becomes a rabbinic place for the rabbis to share what they think should be left in the world. So Tamar, please, from the section of Ketubah, which again typically deals with Jewish marriage contracts, but it's filled with agadot, stories and tales, both totally made up, both totally true, and mostly a mix of the two. So please, Tamar, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi.
Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi further instructed, reconvene the study session at the yeshiva after 30 days of mourning. This is because I am not better than Moses, our teacher, as it is written. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in plains of Moab 30 days. Deuteronomy 34:8, which means that for 30 days they eulogized him by day and night. From this point forward, they eulogized him by day and they studied by night, or they eulogized him by night and studied by day, until they eulogized him for 12 months of the year. The Gemara relates that on the day of the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, a divine voice emerged and said, "Whoever was present at the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is destined for life in the world to come." When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, oops.
Sorry, I just scrolled down a little bit. It's actually
Yeah.
ellipse. Yeah.
However, when was present at the funeral of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is destined for life in the world to come. When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi fell ill, Rabbi Chia entered to be with him and found him crying. He said to him, "My teacher, for what reason are you crying?" And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to him, "I am crying for the Torah and the mitzvot that I will be unable to fulfill after I die."
Thank you. So it is not impossible to believe that he may have, and may certainly have said something like that. But what's more likely that happens, because you see some of these things here are certainly beyond nature, a divine voice coming down, talking about the greatness of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So clearly it was written by a later editor and author, is the question of if one of the greatest teachers of Torah ever, what do we imagine they would have said on their deathbed? What do you think they would have regrets? And it's actually reflected in Jewish law, is that a person who wears tzitzit, a talit katan hanging out, that when they go to a cemetery, they're supposed to tuck them in, because tzitzit used to be much, much longer. They're actually on the bottom of robes. And if they were dragging along on the graves of Jews who had died, it would be an insult, as if to say, you're no longer alive, you can't fulfill mitzvot anymore. That wouldn't be intentional, but that's how it would look. Because even though we believe in heaven and being one with God, there's still an incredible value in this life, because only in this life can we do mitzvot and learn Torah. And so for this version of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that was the most important thing of all. But it's interesting, the beginning of this little section talked about, it seemed like it was so humble of him. I'm no greater than Moshe. Moshe was eulogized for 30 days, so that's all I need. As long as whatever is good enough for Moses, who brought us the Torah down from Mount Sinai, that's good enough for me. So it's like a humble brag kind of thing like that. But again, he becomes the model for somebody who's truly devoted to Torah. What would their last moments on earth look like, and how should we praise them? A lot of all of these sources are, how should we look upon these men who devoted their lives to making sure the Torah was passed down? For those of you who came in a little bit later, we watched a video and it was talking about this transition from ancient Israel to the Torah. And without men like Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, perhaps without him specifically, there wouldn't be Judaism today. He made sure that the Torah would exist till he hoped the temple would be rebuilt, but he made sure Torah was the most important thing that would continue on. So he deserves to be praised. So I think, yeah, the very last source here, I'll take this one. Again, you can see it's actually in the same section, the next page, and the death of him. And one of the interesting things is in this section, it says when he was dying, and then it tells a whole section that moves on, and it's another when he was dying. So one of the other things you pick up in terms of editing is there were multiple manuscripts, multiple tales, multiple versions of his death, and they were all edited into one text. And tomorrow when you were reading it, it said day and night, or was it night and day? Why would they do that? Because they probably had two versions that were almost identical, minus a few words here and there. And the editors felt like sometimes, not always, but sometimes it was important to actually include multiple versions, because Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did. He would often say, this rabbi said this, but it might have been this rabbi. And just to be respectful, why don't I include both possibilities? So at least one of the things I'm saying is correct. So this last section here, the death of Rabbi, again, and it's another retelling of his last moments, as if he died over a period of 20 years. It is related that on the day that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. And again, that's not crazy. We have that with people who are losing today, where we pray, not necessarily fasting, but We really pray that God will be in shul. We pray that people will be healed who are sick. And they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi has died will be stabbed with a sword. So it's not even that we're praying that we'll live, but anybody who, even if he does die, God forbid anybody should say that. We can't admit that one of the greatest Torah teachers ever had died. He needs to continue on, because if he dies, maybe the Torah dies. But that's actually the point. Is what Rabbi Judah the Prince did is make sure that the Torah would continue even without these specific rabbis, because it used to be that the Torah was passed down orally. I would say it, I would memorize the whole thing, teach it in the academy, my students would memorize it, and so on and so forth. And if any of those students died, it's as if all the books would have, burned and disappeared. Rabbi Judah the Prince made it so that it is beyond any one person or group. The maidservant, and in some ways, she's kind of the heroine of the story, of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi ascended to the roof and said, the upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Heaven is waiting. I think that's a movie. But the humans, his fellows, want him to live on. But who do we listen to ultimately, the people or God and the angels? May it be the will of God that the lower world should impose their will upon the upper world. However, so she actually wanted, initially, she wanted heaven and say, God, please listen to the prayers of the fellow rabbis. We can't give him up. He's too important. However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom, I know that seems like kind of an icky detail, but again, you know that this is a true biographical historical fact about him. It was known that he suffered a great deal, and that sensitivity to that suffering is present even here at the end of his life. And remove his phylacteries, his tefillin, and then exit and put them back on, and how he was suffering with his intestinal disease. She said, may it be the will of God that the upper world should impose their will upon the lower world. And this is, we won't dwell on it too much, but it's a very powerful moment to recognize, is when someone is suffering, praying that they live on is not always the appropriate thing. I actually gave a class once on whether you can pray for someone suffering to die. It's not as simple as that, but not praying for them to continue through that suffering is more appropriate, which is what she does. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would not die, so she took a jug. The sages, meanwhile, would not be silent. They would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would not die. And this is actually a common trope, is that certain holy men, as long as they're like King David, there's a story about him, as long as he was learning Torah, the angel of death couldn't come take him. It's only if he was distracted for a moment that the angel of death could come in. So she took a jug, a kuza, and threw it from the roof to the ground. Due to the sudden noise, the sages were momentarily silent. Just try, what's that? And refrained from begging for mercy, and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died. Angel of death got him. The sages said to Bar Kapara, go and ascertain the condition of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. He went and found that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had died. He tore his clothing and reversed them so the tear would be behind him and not be noticed. Remember, the beginning it said, we don't even want to, even if he dies, no one wants to say that. Nobody wants to have the burden of admitting that we have lost such a great Torah light. So when he sees his teacher dies, he fulfills the mitzvah of ripping his clothes, but then he turns his clothes backwards so no one notices it. He wants to hide the truth because he can't deal with the emotional impact of losing such a great man. And of course, irony is not the word here, but it sounds like it's the right word. The great irony is the greatness of Rabbi Yehuda is that even once he was dead, his legacy was, again, as I said, designed so that he would live on far beyond his physical life. That was the beauty, what he committed to this world. He tore his clothing and turned around. And when he returned to the sages, he opened his remarks and said, the angels, Elim, and righteous mortals, Metzukim, both clutched the sacred ark. The angels triumphed over the righteous, and the sacred ark was captured. They said to him as he died, so he's telling this parable, they're like, what happened in there? And he talks about this epic battle between earth and heaven and angels. And they're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. Is he dead or not? He said to them, you said it. I didn't say it, as it had been decided that no one should say that he died. So he basically said to them, something vast happened there. The angels, et cetera, came, and they're like, are you trying to say that he dead? And he's like, you said it. I didn't want the words to come from my mouth. So again, even though this is, somewhat a legend, there's some very human and sensitive moments in here about loss of life, especially with such a beloved figure. It is further related at the time of death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and again, this is something that's, again, a bit perhaps legendary, but it still represents who we think Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was. He raised his 10 fingers towards heaven and said in prayer, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that I toiled with my 10 fingers on the Torah, and I have not derived any benefit from the world, even with my small finger. May it be your will that there be peace in my repose. And there are lines like this in the Torah about God. I never took anything. And Yaakov did that. It's this trope about I never took anything that wasn't due me. I dedicated my life to hard work. Please, as a reward for everything I've done and all the suffering I've gone through, please let me rest and peace. And there's a little bit more to the story after that in some verses, but this is ultimately the end of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi as a person. But as you can see, in many ways, it's the beginning of him as a legend. It's the beginning of him as a foundational source for what Judaism has and continues to become, because it's not just the fact that he compiled the Mishnah and made sure that those texts wouldn't be lost. It's how he did it. Because instead of just saying, here's a practical dry book of the law, which we have those, and they're incredible and they're important, what he says is, I want to list the people, the names, the voices, and I want to, as I said that phrase, codify the disagreements. I want to make sure that you know that there were arguments, there were people who respected each other, who would go back and forth. And I want to make sure that even though I'm writing this down, that continues, because the greatest fear of writing down the oral tradition is that it would, which was a flexible, living tradition of debate and adapting to the times, is once you write it down, that's over. Now, in many ways, that fear came true. Jewish law is, post the Mishnah, was much less adaptable. It changed far less than it could have had it continued to just be one which was living and alive in the academies. But at the same time, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did lay the foundation for multiple opinions. And to this day, we still have the flexibility of going back to the Talmud and saying, look, there were several opinions, and we can choose which one is the most appropriate, which one has the most weight. So even though it's not as flexible as it once was, because of the way he chose to write it down, he still allowed for the tradition not only to continue, but to thrive thousands of years and continue, God willing, even thousands of years after that, after his life. So while there's certain parts of his biography that we can be certain about, and certain that became legend, the one thing we can be sure of is that without Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, without Rabbi Judah the Prince, not only would Judaism as we know it not be the same today, we may not even, as a religion, continue to exist without the hard work, dedication, and investment that he put into the Jewish people.